Welcome, everybody. I'm Jill Jonathan from Red, Wine, and Blue. We're a community of women who use digital media and friend-to-friend organizing to change the world one suburb at a time. And so let's be honest, like in the suburbs, there's a lot of talk about books being banned, and that's affecting the libraries. So we are excited to talk to a librarian today who actually happens to work with Red, Wine, and Blue also. So Joe is here to join us, and then we have Carrie to join us. So welcome, ladies. Thank you so much.
Hi.
Hello. So Carrie, let's start with you because you are the librarian. And you were saying like not a lot of people think about librarians unless your kids are in school or if you go to the public library. And I know, I'll be honest, when I think of a librarian, I think of Mrs. Ayers, who was my elementary school librarian. She was amazing. And she used to wear her hair like up like this and these cute little glasses and just was sweet and just a lovely person. So I just have fond memories of librarians. My kids' school librarians are just amazing people who seem to just really want to help them find the right book and to help them like learn more about the world. So that's what I think. So it's really terrifying to think that librarians are being attacked in this day and age. So Carrie, first of all, would love to you tell us a little bit about your background of being a librarian.
So, in my early 30s, I decided to go back to get my master's degree in library and information science. And a lot of people don't realize that librarians need to have a master's degree in order to be considered a librarian, and that school librarians have to have even more training. So there's a lot of education involved there. Once I left library school in 2012, I worked for a small seminary outside of Pittsburgh. And then I had my son and was off for a year with him, luckily, and was approached actually by a large corporation here in Pittsburgh as well to be their intellectual property research and chemistry librarian at one of their sites, which I loved. It was great. Like I got to work with the coolest people who had the coolest interests and just great senses of humor. And then after that, I also worked for a nonprofit museum here in the area because I moved. My commute was too long, so I ended up leaving the job that I really loved and was in charge of their research and archives department for a little while. And then COVID hit, and I had a 7-year-old, so ended up taking some time off to assist him. And it was kind of then that I found myself with Red, Wine, and Blue. But a lot of people don't realize that museums and corporations and other hospitals all employ librarians as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I didn't know the master's degree that was needed. I kind of feel like, hey, I want to go to library school.
I mean, it's great. Yeah. And it's a lot of fun. I've taken really interesting classes. I took one at a conference called How to Find People Who Don't Want to Be Found. So you can learn anything. Like it's great. I would do something called competitive intelligence, which is kind of considered like it's not spying, but it's ethical, looking at other groups or companies to see what they're doing through not private means, but public, information, and kind of putting together like a dossier about them. So a lot of interesting things that librarians end up doing besides just recommending books and answering questions.
Yeah. And what brought you to Red, Wine, and Blue? So how do you go from being a librarian here to doing the work that we do?
So in that time that I was off, it was actually last February of 2022, there's an author here who had just written a book and became pretty popular. And a number of people in the Pittsburgh area follow him. And I made some comment about, and the author is a Black gay man. So his memoir it wasn't necessarily spicy, but there were some, parts that were, I guess, more adult, and it is meant for an adult audience. I made some offhand comment about, well, if they try to ban your book, I have your back. And another woman who I've since become friends with made a comment like, can I talk to you in private message? And we ended up chatting, and I found out that the district that she works in was starting to ban some books in their library. Some parents were agitating, and I said, I have some resources. And at that time, I wasn't working for Red, Wine, and Blue, but I knew other librarians who were involved in kind of like the First Amendment rights and intellectual freedom. And so I contacted them. There's a group called Every Library, and Red, Wine, and Blues worked with them. Well, I talked to them about this issue, and the guy at Every Library said, you really need to check out the book ban busters from Red, Wine, and Blue. Like, he referred me to them, and I hadn't heard of them at that point. And so the Pennsylvania group had just started. I joined. I started reading the book ban busters. I'm sending them stuff. And, by August, I ended up being a regional organizer. So it was all kind of serendipitous. So, I mean, really, it was librarianship that led me to end up working for Red, Wine, and Blue.
Yeah, it's interesting. Awesome. It's like we don't choose these paths, right? Like sort of they choose us because we can't look away and put our heads in the sand when, situations arise like what we're facing right now as a reality. It's interesting. I wanted to go back to you talking about some of the training and education that librarians need just to be a librarian. I don't think people realize that these librarians, for instance, in public schools, they aren't just like, book interested, curious people. They're really well educated, and their responsibility for curating, the books in these libraries is something they don't take lightly. And they are definitely under attack right now, especially in the public schools. And it's interesting because I think that people are undermining what it is that they're actually doing and the guidelines that they're following and how carefully they're cultivating these collections in their schools.
Absolutely. I mean, almost every librarian I know who has had to take a class in collection development, which means, we've had a whole semester in how to do this. And then on top of that, there's professional guidelines, there's continuing education, there's all of this other stuff. And then school librarians are also teachers on top of it. And so, they have an education degree and this master's degree, and probably a master's degree in education as well, many times, especially in Pennsylvania where those sorts of things are required. So, yeah, it's not just some fly by night, hey, this is a book I like, the cover looks interesting, I'm going to put this here, or, there's so many guidelines. And the whole thing is like, all libraries are meant to be inclusive rather than exclusive. And so that means that these librarians are trying to cultivate a collection that's inclusive of everybody and representative of their communities. And so there may be things that are offensive or maybe beyond certain kids, reading ability, but they're trying to make it so that everybody has access and something that they can see themselves in.
Right. So it's the idea of windows and mirrors, right? It's like you can, see yourself reflected in these books, which is so important. There's been so many studies, particularly about LGBTQ plus kids who, their truancy goes up if they don't feel like they're seen in their schools. Suicide attempts and thoughts of suicide and self-harm increase when they don't see themselves reflected in their school communities. But the same can be said for the windows, for the kids who don't know, aren't transgender or don't know many people who are. So it's so important for them to see that too. It helps the health overall of the entire school community, which helps all of our kids, right? I just wanted to talk to you about this idea because I think what we're looking at right now in society is there isn't just an attack on books and curriculum anymore. It used to be like, what are they teaching? Now they're trying to remove books just from being able to be accessed by all children. So can you speak to that a little bit? It's not about just removing something that's required reading. It's removing a child's access to something that is optional.
And I mean, the whole fact that, going into the library and checking out a book that's optional, and yet we want to limit that, is completely mind-blowing to me. And that somebody wants to control all of that and thinks that, especially when they keep saying, hey, this is about parents' rights. And even during the pandemic, the rallying cry was, what's good for your kid isn't necessarily what's good for my kid, so my kid can't wear a mask. Well, then how are we going to apply that, the exact opposite mentality here? I know that, for example, my son, his other parent is trans, and then we divorced, and now we live in a family. We all get along great, but like, he has some different experiences than his peers, and I'd love for him to be able to get books either at the public library or his school library, about that, where he sees himself, where there's a divorced family with multiple parents who, I always say, it's so, he has more people who love him and care about him. But I guess it's also, comes back to, since 1974, people have had the right to opt their children out of curriculum, books, whatever. They could always call the librarian or the administration and say, hey, I don't want my kid reading this book. Can you make sure they don't do that? How are we going to make it so that that applies to everyone? And there's seemingly no acknowledgement of prior case law. Like, they don't even acknowledge that these things like pornography and obscenity have already been set on case law. Like, they're like, yeah, we're just going to use these, highly inflammatory words and hope that people, don't know what they mean and don't realize that there are no obscene books in your library, like, for real.
I know how it's affecting me as a parent of an 8th grader and a 5th grader, who I want them to have access to all kinds of books. And I'm a parent who, would be like, yes, that's great. I want them to read that. And not every parent maybe is as open as I am. And like you said, then you have that, you can opt out of different things. So I feel like Joe and I definitely know, and you obviously, Carrie, as a parent, like, we know how it's affecting the parents. But, being a librarian, and I'm sure you have friends that are kind of on the front lines of dealing with this, how is it affecting librarians? Like, how are they feeling? This worries me. I feel like it's like teachers. Like, how are they going to stay in the profession that they love when they're being treated like this?
I have had friends that I graduated with from grad school and also from undergrad who ended up going into librarianship, and they've since left the profession after, gosh, how many years, because it's not worth it to sit there and be called a pedophile, a groomer, whatever else, just for providing books. They don't want to do this day in and day out, for the rest of their lives, when they're really there just to help people. And, the other thing is, librarian, you're never going to get rich being a librarian. A lot of librarians, even library directors, they can make the same amount of money going to work at Aldi or a grocery store or something like that with better benefits, because without being called a groomer or a pedophile or anything else at this time. So, there are a lot who are leaving. There are a lot who are looking to change careers mid-career and just are willing to walk away from that pension because they haven't willing to walk away from the good benefits because it's causing them to wake up in the middle of the night. They're developing health problems from it. Just all kinds of things like that. And, it's probably also worth pointing out, much like nurses and teachers, librarianship is female dominated. Yep. And so they're being attacked on that front too, and it seems like these helping professions that are female dominated are just taking the brunt of it over the last 3 or 4 years and just getting attacked ruthlessly. So.
And that's not by accident. You know what I mean? That's very much by design. I was listening to an interview with a historian before this interview, and she was talking about how throughout history we've seen sort of this attack on the people who are doing the work. This, providing the services is particularly related to content and like what a library, public library, school library, what a library provides the public with access to, which is information, right? And information of all sorts, and information when used against them, those who lean towards authoritarianism, doesn't benefit them. So by attacking the people who are the stewards of this, place for information gathering and chasing them out of the profession, they're able to dismantle the very thing itself. So it's like, we've seen this throughout history. It's unbelievable to me. And it breaks my heart, honestly. I worked in education for a long time. I know how hard educators work. I know how hard librarians work. I know how selfless that work is, because like you said, you don't go into it to be rich. And to see what is happening, to see that, librarians and educators are being called groomers, like you said, pedophiles, all of these horrible, terrible names because they're doing their jobs, right? Like they're doing the hard work. It breaks my heart. It makes me sick. And it's heartbreaking, especially because it is being successful in chasing people out of these professions. But who can blame them? Right? Like, what kind of person can sustain that? So like, it breaks my heart. We really need to be lifting these people up as much as humanly possible. And that's what these conversations are so good at, because it puts a face on what's happening. And you were talking about, your friends and peers who are leaving the profession. And we know we've heard 100 stories like that, right, Jill, of educators who can't do it anymore.
Oh, yeah. I mean, even I'll just interject this, who has not worked in a public library or a school library, just as soon as people find out that I'm a librarian or have that degree or identify as that is my profession, they've called me a pedophile and groomer, and they don't even know what I do. And I'm just like, sure, I'm providing patents to people. That is definitely grooming right there. Like, it's so ridiculous. They just have this knee-jerk reaction to that they've picked up somewhere.
And what is the long game here? I mean, the thing that so professionals leaving the profession is alarming. Books being banned is alarming. Our kids not having access to what they should be having access to is alarming. And now, like in Missouri, we're seeing legislators voting to defund public libraries. Like, what is the long game here? I don't understand. Do they just want us all to be stupid? Like,
yes.
That's the only thing that I can imagine. And, I would imagine that the long game is very similar to what's going on with public education. What other public institution do we have out there? The public library. Mm-hmm. What do public libraries do? They provide information. A lot of times they help marginalized folks. They provide resources for people who don't have access to them. In cities, they're providing anything from Narcan to health resources to, sometimes being a place where the unhoused can go. And so, and in rural communities, they're oftentimes the places where folks who don't have access to internet or don't have access to high-speed internet can go. So, is the end game the further marginalization of people who aren't them,
Right. And information. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, just to kind of piggyback on that, information is such a powerful tool, powerful weapon. When you have a public that's armed with facts and truth and diversity of thought, then you're very much less inclined to be able to keep them under your thumb. But if they have a narrow worldview, and if their options of a path forward for them, particularly in marginalized communities, out of that reality is narrowed by the lack of access to information, then it's much easier for a small group of people to control the masses. And it sounds like, dystopic. It says dystopia. It sounds like, Orwellian. These things sound hyperbolic, but it's true. I mean, it's not like we couldn't look back, if we had really good libraries, at history books that aren't being banned, that will show you time after time throughout the course of history, this is the path that was taken. And we're seeing it playing out right in front of us. It's really staggering. I mean, when we asked to live in interesting times, I don't think any of us had this in mind.
Right. So, I mean, this is not even something I imagined when I was in grad school in 2010, 2011, 2012 at all. Like, it was kind of like this footnote in classes, like, hey, you might get somebody who might complain. Here's how you handle it. And to your point about information, I wanted to bring this up. School librarians are often on the front lines of teaching kids media literacy and how to spot disinformation. Right. And so, there you go. That's probably yet another reason. English teachers, history teachers, and librarians are the ones who are doing that, who's under attack.
Right. And being defunded.
Yep.
And what's going to happen if those libraries are defunded? What happens to them? Who do they get funding at all, or do they just go away?
In some cases, they go away. They have to shutter themselves. In Pennsylvania, I can speak to this at least. So Pennsylvania is very low in receiving state funding for their libraries. And in order to receive any part of the pie, you need to have your community, because it's their library, put in a certain amount of money. And so one way that libraries in Pennsylvania, public libraries, are being attacked, at least, is through a lot of ballot initiatives to defund the library through decreases in millage. And it's always like, hey, you're going to get your tax money back. But then when you break it down, it's like, oh yeah, you're getting $1.53 back, like, each month, maybe. And so, but, if they're not getting that money from their community, from the local taxes, the property taxes, and they're not getting that money from the state because the community hasn't put in that money, then they have to lay off all the librarians. They have to shutter their doors. They have to, cut hours. They're essentially shuttered through those means. Now, other states, I'm not entirely sure, because each state has a different way that they fund. For example, Hawaii's great. Their state funds like 90%, gives them 90% of their budget. They're like number one in the nation. But so, yeah, I mean, it's just another tactic. And at least here, I can say, anytime I start to see a public library being attacked, I know, or, there's an attempt on defunding here, I know that it's coming to the schools next.
Right. It's so interesting too, to like explore, what the argument coming from the other side is for all of this, right? Like for the attack on librarians, for the defunding of public libraries. The other side is saying that this is in the interest of protecting people, right? Like in the cases of public schools, it's in the interest of protecting our kids. Meanwhile, statistically, right, this is what they're talking about. And you know this very well. 41% of all the books that they're banning, and the reason that they're saying that, librarians are groomers and pedophiles, et cetera, and the reason that they're trying to justify, defunding public libraries, 41% of the books that they're banning are LGBTQ plus themes. 40%, the protagonist or, preeminent secondary character of color. These are the books that they're holding up and saying they're inappropriate, to the point where these libraries should have all their books removed from the shelves for review. Books about, by the way, like, Sotomayor and Roberto Clemente for review. Now, all the books are being removed from the shelves, or they're shuttering their doors completely because they've been defunded. Like, what's really behind that, right? Because it's under the guise of protecting our children, when these are the books that they're using as their argument for protecting them.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where you can look at it, like you said, you just gave the statistics, and it's been that way. There's been a change over the last decade. Previously it was about witchcraft and things like that. So Harry Potter was largely, challenged. And now all of a sudden, in the last 3 years, we have this sudden focus everywhere on people of color and LGBTQ main characters or themes. And, I wonder why, when and none of these districts that I've worked with had a book challenge they couldn't tell you when, ever, prior to this. And then all of a sudden, 2021, 2022, just tons of it. And it's just popping up. So, I mean, they'll deny it, but I personally think it's obvious. I don't want to speak for all librarians, but I mean, I think the statistics bear out there. If you look at Penn America, you look at the ALA list, all of it, you know.
Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to go back to something real quick that you said before. You mentioned very briefly the pandemic. And so I don't think, and Jill and I've had this conversation with lots of people on lots of subjects, because what we've seen is this huge shift, right? Like on so many different levels and so many different issues. And in particular, someplace we've really seen this is in these libraries with these books and this like call for book bans. The pandemic and this mask mandate, vaccine mandate, there was something that happened to a lot of parents, right? I don't want to say they snapped, but it sort of feels like that, right? Like where all of a sudden there is this huge push for people to say like, I don't want that in my school. I'm taking my power back. I'm taking my control back. And it feels like so mixed up and muddled and confused. But I feel like there is definitely a connection between the pandemic and what we're looking at and this huge spike that you just mentioned just now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic was an opportunity to galvanize a lot of people. Like what happened in January 2021. Oh, right. Moms for Liberty came on the scene. And then we had No Left Turn come in shortly after that. So then people are galvanized. Then the pandemic starts in March. And then we start seeing all of these things pop up in July and August of 2021. No masks, kids need to go back to school 5 days a week, no vaccines. And then that kind of, it's not gone away, but it's petered out. And so what's the next galvanizing? So I think, we're looking at a group that's really opportunistic and just they have a built-in audience and they're just feeding one inflammatory thing after another. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's tied up in that way, in that who's driving it, not necessarily that it's that they're related any other way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I see that. And I'm glad you asked that, Joe. I was thinking the same thing. I'm like, when you look at, what big thing happened in the last 3 years that made this shift. And I think we're just going to see so many more effects of how the pandemic has affected us all, and definitely the education system, which is very concerning to me. So Carrie, how can people like us support librarians and libraries? I mean, what can we do? I think that's what all of us are like, okay, we know this, now what can we do?
So what I have told people in the past is, if you aren't a user of the library, make sure, whether it's the school library and your kids are just like, nah, I'm going to play on the computer and not check books out, like encourage them to actually start checking books out. Or if you have a public library, go there, get your library card, and books that may be up for challenge in your community, start checking them out. Because one thing that helps librarians, they're very statistics based. And so they can say, no, look, there's a need for this in our community, and the statistics bear it out. Our circulation statistics bear it out. Another thing, if you're active at all within your children's schools, maybe get to be friends with the librarian or whoever's in charge of curriculum and instruction, and just maybe gently encourage them, or not so gently, to make sure that they have a pretty airtight collection policy at the school board level, at the district level, and check that out. Whether, and in Pennsylvania, there's a number of them. There's collection development, there's like withdrawal weeding, there's a couple others on, what's appropriate material, and just make sure that, it gives the librarian and recognizes that their expertise in that, not that it's giving the school board or the administration the power to choose your children's books and collection. And, this is National Library Week is coming up at the end of the month. It might be, just take the time to even write your children's librarians at school, a thank you note, like, hey, thanks for helping my kids pick out books. They really love this specific book and talked about it. Or, send them a gift card. Same thing with public librarians. And, I don't want to, like, I know we're focusing on librarians here, but there are lots of people who work in libraries who are very knowledgeable, but don't have that librarian degree. You know, they work at the circ desk, they are shelving books, and oftentimes they're getting the brunt of this too, just because they are in the library and they're front facing. You know, be sure to thank them too and acknowledge them and their hard work, because they're often overlooked, and they're getting a lot of the ire of people who are coming in and saying, hey, no, like, you know, this book is awful. You're a pedophile. And they're like, I get paid $7.50 to, you know, scan your books. Like, you know, basically like, ma'am, this is a Wendy's kind of week. But, you know, I think those are very tangible, small, but meaningful ways to help out either directly or behind the scenes.
I love that. Those are such great ideas.
They're great ideas. And it really does sort of bring into focus the fact that these are unsung heroes who didn't sign up for any of this, right? Like nobody goes to work to be in a circ desk to have to be facing being called a groomer every day.
Exactly. They're like, I just like working here and I'm friendly, and, you know, I do like to check out books or know what's coming. Like, you know, there's so much that goes into it. Like I've told people, most of us just want to work our 30 years and like we don't have an agenda, you know, there's no like secret librarian agenda. We're like, we happen to like this. We're, you know, somewhat organized. We like diving into details and, you know, helping people. We did not sign up. Like we want to work our 30 years and retire. Like, kind of.
Right, no agenda.
Like anybody else.
I love that there's no librarian agenda.
I know.
Where we are.
Librarian agenda. Go to happy hour. Like, you know, wear sweats on the weekends. I'll throw another, you know, buy another cardigan, get a cat, like that kind of stuff. All those librarian tropes that you hear about. But like seriously, you know, my agenda in life is really to like eat tacos and like, you know, hang out with my kid. Yeah. Like,
that sounds so woke. I can't believe
I know.
that.
There is never a time in my life where I would have ever described myself as woke. So this is like bizarre to me, you know.
It is. So I feel like that just sums up like the librarians do not have an agenda.
Perfect.
Calm down.
No, like the librarian's agenda, get more funding for the library, like that, hire another part-time worker. Like that's the agenda.
The agenda is to be well funded so they can do their job.
My evil plan is to make everyone wear cardigans and get 4 cats. That's my evil librarian agenda.
Exactly. I mean, it's like, you know, not to pull out another meme, but like the gay agenda where they're like, you know, eat tacos on Tuesday. Like that's just very benign, like goofy things. Librarian agenda, same thing.
Same thing.
And we often say on these interviews, like on these conversations, like we're laughing about really heavy subjects, but like at the end of the day, like we have to find just like a little bit of levity in all of the craziness because it's how it keeps us going.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think librarians have some pretty decent senses of humor. You know. Yeah,
and that's why I love, like, I'm a person who really likes like words of affirmation. Like that means a lot to me personally. So I like to give that to other people. So already I'm like, oh, I'm going to write a card to my son's librarian. Like I'm going to show up at my public library. I'm like already like, just to let people know, like, listen, you're appreciated.
Yeah. I see you.
Yeah, exactly. I see you.
Love it.
And I think, you know, well, one last thing I would say that, and this is probably a big thing, you know, if you're invested at a higher level, it might be worth it to investigate how to get onto your public library's board too.
Oh, that's a great
idea. You know, but that would be a little bit more of a higher aspiration, but for something immediate, you know, definitely the words of affirmation.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, the librarians are not okay, but they're chugging along like the rest of us, right? Yeah. I don't know. Carrie, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you both for thinking of me and for having me on. I love talking with you and talking about something that, you know, I do love doing and hope to return to at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Definitely check us out at redwine.blue. Carrie mentioned Book Band Busters, so we have a whole section about that. We've got a band book club. Joe and I interview different authors who have had books banned. So there's all kinds of information on our website. So definitely check that out. Thanks for joining, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Take care.
Thank you.